to see you.
Hey, great to be here with Eileen and with you, and let's go.
All right. Well, look, first of all, let me congratulate you on your induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It's one of the highest honors that someone like you could achieve, and it's certainly well deserved. What was that like to get that call?
Well, it was thrilling to get the call, and I'll tell you what I appreciated was that while I'm obviously and happily best known for my work with Bruce for the last 45 years, I really began as a critic, and as they said, a pioneer critic. And I had a whole life in journalism that was very innovative at the time. And that was very much part of the material they released uh, concerning my induction. I think it was part of my profile, which was a pioneering rock critic, producer, and ultimately manager. So there were three pieces that combined, I guess, to to cause them
Yeah.
to give me the award.
Well, look, I mean, most people do know you as Bruce's manager and producer, but as you said, I mean, going back prior to, say, 1974, 73, those days when you were very active as a music critic, a lot of people might not realize that um, it was a relatively new form, a relatively new
Well,
literary form, music criticism, and you were there at the forefront to helping establish that. Explain how that happened. How did you get into music
well,
criticism?
the the, the first I was a music crazed child of who grew up with music in the from the first time I heard it in the late 40s when my parents when I was born in 1947, and it was just from around age 4 I knew that, and some part of me knew that music was just going to be a permanent part of my life, and I became especially interested in folk music, and my first hero was Pete Seeger, who I saw perform when I was 4 years old at a children's concert. And when I saw him, I said, "That's for me. What he's doing right there, that's the most excited I had been in my young life, you know." And so I always feel a debt of gratitude to him. I got to know him later in life. Wonderful, um, slightly cranky, uh, uh, very entertaining person who led a very rich life. Anyway, I was living in the Boston area, and we had a high school newspaper at Lexington High School, and I was the editor of the paper for a while, and I started writing record reviews. And this was in 1961 or 62. And the thing about rock writing was that it barely existed. And in terms of how it was typically covered, it was, newspapers, if there was a big concert that they couldn't ignore, the Beatles were in town, they'd send a utility player. They might send a sports writer who had the night off or didn't have an event to cover. It was the idea of a specialist or having a rock critic on staff. Uh, you know, I guess the New York Times had one of the first named Mike Jan, but in general, and Bob Hilburn came very early. Um, in Los Angeles, but in general, there was no such thing. And so, various people, including myself, started finding outlets, underground papers, so on and so forth. Richard Goldstein was one of the first, writing in the Village Voice. And I was writing the great music center at that time in the Boston area was the legendary Club 47. And starting in high school, I was there 4 nights a week. But you'd see everybody. It was just incredible. And they had like a giveaway sheet almost, and it was called I think it was called the Phoenix in some very early um, incarnation. Or no, well, I'm not, I'm not sure on that. My mind gets a little rusty on details, but I started giving them things of mine to publish, and they did one or two. I was still in high school when this happened, and then they decided whatever. They didn't continue with me. And the big one came when I was working in a music store in Harvard Square called Briggs and Briggs, and it was half the store was classical music scores. It was where all the classical musicians at Harvard, got their copies of the symphonies and whatever the music was that they were doing. So that was one side of the store, and the other side of the store was a sort of was records, was albums. Not a very big store, and I got a summer job there, and I really hit it off with the nice folks there, and they let me sort of revitalize um, the rock area. It was my only experience with thievery because I used to walk out of there with albums that I didn't pay for, and it was so loose that I mean, one night I was walking out with six different albums. It didn't matter, but there was a guy named Paul Williams, the late Paul Williams, who had started a little magazine called Crawdaddy, which was, just one step up from being mimeographed and stapled. And it cost 25 cents or 50 cents. And he would come around with the new issue. There'd been 3 or 4 issues, and he was great to talk to. He'd always engage me. He might have been even more opinionated than me, and uh, he asked, "Could I leave this here with you? By the cash register?" He was just trying to get it, out there wherever he could in the local neighborhood. So I said, "Yeah, sure." So I read and he gave me the issues that had been published, a couple of them. And next time he came in, I said, "Listen, what do you? I can write better than any of these guys. Why don't why don't you publish me? I'll give you some good stuff." So he said, "Great," and I became a regular writer there. And bit by bit, he was picking up very interesting people. Um, a critic who also, like myself, went into record production, Sandy Perlman, started there. The famous Richard Meltzer was there. Um, Paul himself was outstanding as a critic, and I was there.
And didn't you have Peter Guralnick also was from the area at the time, right?
well, he's a great writer, and he goes back to that time. I'm not remembering him as
Yeah,
part of the Crawdaddy group, but
yeah, yeah,
so he's one of our greatest music writers ever. Um, the and we knew each other well around those times. Anyway, I started publishing in different places, and the big thing came when I got a letter from San Francisco in the end of 1967 when I was 20. And this person said, well, I'm going to start a new magazine. And he had a sample issue, a dummy that he had
yeah,
sent me. And he said, I'm a big fan of your writing, and I want you to be our lead music writer, starting with the first issue, and you'll have a whole page every issue, which was a lot. It was a lot. It was a large format magazine. So and he said, we pay. He said, we'll pay you $25 an article. All these other things that I'd been doing, there was no pay. You just did it because you loved doing it. This was, this is like being like a professional writer already. So that was Jan Wenner. And he started publishing Rolling Stone 1967, early 68. And I spent 10 years there being, I was the lead music writer. I was the assignment editor of all the record reviews that appeared in Rolling Stone. And I accumulated a lot of influence both through my writing and through the choices I made about coverage. And it was really a golden point for rock journalism. And going back to the broader press, this is the time where newspapers, magazines started seeking out young, energetic people to write it. And the thing, writing about rock music became a legitimate thing. Up until all of this, up until, let's say, the Rolling Stone era, the way you learned about rock music and musicians primarily was from teen magazines. And there was a really good one called Hit Parader, and that had interviews with very unlikely people. It had the very slick, teen-oriented visuals, but there was actual content in it. And that was a guy named Jim Delahans, and he just had a. He was one of the guys in there at the beginning. So, and of course, in Boston, we had it gets confusing, but there was the Phoenix, the Boston Phoenix, an offshoot called the Real Paper, and that were weeklies. And I would write for one of them. So I was writing for them on a weekly basis and writing for Rolling Stone every other. I wrote an incredible amount,
yeah.
and I
Let me
published
ask,
one
let me ask
collection
you
of
this,
it in 1971 called "It's Too Late to Stop Now," which was
right?
a collection of my writings up until that point. And if you want to talk about collector's items, there's a collector's item. Find one, send it to me because I only have 3 copies here. My mother loved it, but the mass audience missed out there. And so
Well, let me ask you this. Obviously, this was not in your game plan, so to speak, to be a music critic, because, as you said, growing up, there really wasn't any. Had you not discovered writing, music writing, what place in music would you have pursued? Would you have become a producer? Would you have were you a musician at the time? Or how would it have gone? What was the alternative?
well, that's a lot of that's an interesting constellation of questions. I was I started playing the guitar at age 7. So that was in, well, maybe a little bit older, 1955 or so. And I played the guitar all throughout these years in the in the 60s, and well, I was playing in the 50s, learning, and I I became a good guitar player, and I had a high school band. My first band in high school was just covers, and we play at the equivalent of high school fraternity parties. These were some, the Saturday night, somebody had a house, the parents were away for the weekend, and you would have the wildest, drunkest brawl, you couldn't even imagine. I remember, we had a limited repertoire, and I just remember one night playing What I Say for, you know, 25 minutes, just it was good times, craziness. And then I had a band in college, which was called a Jelly Roll, which was a sort of a play off of the Lemon Spoonful name. And um, we played around, and we were pretty good. I got offered my the lead singer in the group, and the better of the songwriters, me and him wrote the songs. He was really good. But they didn't offer, Columbia didn't offer us a contract for the group, but they offered us Tom and John, and there was a Simon and Garfunkel out there at the time. And so, I guess, and I had an identity crisis because I said, is this what I really want to do? I was a college sophomore or junior at the time when I would have had to leave. And I said, you know, I've been around enough musicians. I've seen so much music and listened to so much music. And I said, well, I'm very good at this. I'm good. Am I going to be great at it? No. I just made a very realistic. I was a good journeyman. Could I have played rhythm guitar in a successful band? Yes, I could. But I was more ambitious than that. That didn't seem to be enough. Uh, so I set that aside at a certain point. As time went on, and we get to the late '60s. Now I've been writing for several years at Rolling Stone, and been writing longer. I've been writing for many years at that point. I started figuring out, what about this record production thing? I was very tuned into record producers. I was a sophisticated listener. I could identify the style and sound of, you know, of 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 the different producers who were becoming prominent. I could tell a Paul Rothchild record. Um, you could tell. So I, and of course, I had met as a journalist, and because really become the most famous of the rock critics. Um, and so record companies were always in touch with me about uh, uh, promoting their new releases, and so I met the heads of all the companies and got along with some of them. And the two that really most were Jerry Wexler, who was a mentor, a true mentor, and Jack Holzman, who was the head of Elektra. And not to get too uh, lengthy here, but um, when I had an interest in producing, I turned to them, and through a variety of circumstance and interesting stories for another time, I wound up producing a group called the MC5. And that was in 1969. And their album might sound a little familiar, the title, their album was Back in the USA. And I love this record to this day. I love the guys. I love the group. They were this radical group from Ann Arbor, Michigan, highly political. Um, the three main guys, Rob Tyner, the singer and and the lyric writer most of the time, Wayne Kramer, one of the two lead guitar players, and the famous Fred Sonic Smith. And I just learned so much from them. And I have to say they learned a little from me. It was a very um, great
Sweet.
experience. I lived with them in a commune for 4 months, way outside of Ann Arbor, and I'd never had any kind of. I was like a baby, and I just, you know, it was a great time. It was a great time, and the record. I love the record, but it wasn't successful, and I didn't get to do another one.
Would you say that at this particular point, after you kind of get your hands dirty with record production, that the idea of becoming a record producer kind of supersedes anything that you might do journalistically long term? I mean, you saw yourself perhaps as another Jerry Wexler or somebody in record production.
I think that I had a lot of cross currents floating around in my head, a lot of opportunities, uh, and I had written an amazing amount of material in a short amount of time, hundreds of thousands of words. And I liked the security of the journalism. I had the recognition, um, and I had started to, earn a living from it, going back from the days where you got nothing. And but I really thought I might have something to offer as a record producer, and I continued on. I kept with the journalism. I took a leave to do MC5 because that was, and then I worked with a singer songwriter, another aspect of my taste. A young guy at the time, Livingston Taylor, who's a fantastic artist, and I did 2 albums with him, and they were just as much learning experiences. They were tremendous.
That's a long way from the MC5. Livingston Taylor, of course, brother of James Taylor, very much in that kind of singer songwriter thing from the late 60s, early 70s. The MC5, is that an example or a reflection of your music interest?
Well, yeah, but then there was also the folk element and the bluegrass elements. I went through a phase in around 1961 or 62, where I really did become a bluegrass fanatic. I learned to play the banjo in the Scruggs style. Um, the Stanley brothers, who became famous from Ralph Stanley's great performance in "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou," or whatever. My
Yeah,
butcher
that's
name.
right.
The I was just hearing their music as they were creating it and releasing it on the Star Day label and King Records, and they were just phenomenal. I mean, I tell you that They have a song to this day. The song is called Harbor of Love, the gospel. They were the greatest country gospel. Every
Yeah.
other album was a gospel album. They do a secular album and they do a gospel album. This song, it just blew my mind. The harmony on it, it just blew my mind. And the singing, they played great, but for me, it was the singing, you know. And so my range, I was very broad range. I
Yeah.
was very broad range, and of course, I loved R&B, and I spent a lot of time writing about that. Wasn't much of a jazz guy. My dad, that's all he ever listened to. But for me personally, no. So this all comes together one night in a fairly well-known story, in which uh, Bruce has come to play in um, a club in Harvard Square, and I go to see him play, and there were 15, 20 people there. I mean, not more. The Wildly Innocent had come out and had been a commercial failure. Uh, the first album, which when Clive signed Bruce, of course, with John Hammond and Clive signed Bruce, Clive made a major effort, really promoted the album, the new Dylan vibe, the whole thing. And then Clive left the company. And when Bruce's second album came out, he was sort of orphaned. And so, he was out there working wherever he could. And anyway, I went to see him just like I would go to see a lot of stuff. Well, I'd written a review of The Wildly Innocent, and for the real paper, I think it was, not the famous article. So when I go in to the club, I'm looking around, and I wanted to say hello. I usually, concerts often would say hello to the artist, So uh, I said, I'd like to meet him. I said to the club owner, uh, where's, I don't know if there were dressing rooms. I mean, it was as low rent as could
Right.
be. He says outside, and Bruce tells his story in his own way, better than I do in Born to Run. Um, and I go out there, and in my recollection, it's a chilly night, and he's standing there in his t-shirt, and he's hopping up and down. And the owner had put this review of Wildly Innocent in the window because he thought it would help attract
Yeah.
walk-in business. So I go up to him, and he's just, reading through. And I said, well, so what do you think? So he said, well, uh, this guy's pretty good. He's okay. Introduced myself. Um, so see the show, and I had a phenomenal reaction to it. And as I've said on a few other occasions, I don't get interviewed that much, or I don't do that many interviews. But I have, when I have spoken about it, is, well, um, I get a call the next day. After the show, Bruce and I had a chance to talk with Mike Appel, and we were all talking about things. They were filling me in on his situation, which was pretty dire at the time. Seemed like there were some people at the label post Clive who were thinking about dropping him or recommending that. Or, he was not getting the support at that point. And I was living in a little house in Concord, Massachusetts, and the next day, and I had my office there. I worked at home and did all the things that I did for Rolling Stone. I pick up the phone. It's Bruce. Hey, hi, it's Bruce. I had no idea. The call was so unexpected that I really I didn't make a connection. Like, this is the guy from last night. So we started talking, and there were a lot of things in my article that had grabbed his attention. And we started talking then, and I think it was, it felt like, you know, it felt like a couple of hours. It might have been a half an hour, but the main thing was we just started yakking. And as he says, and as I say, well, that was the beginning of the conversation we're still having. It never ended. And so the journalism, the article in the window, and the production idea, which came into play over time a little while later, and the fact that I did have a base of musical knowledge that enabled me to be a contributor in a production situation sort of all came together at that moment.
Yeah. If I recall correctly, when Greetings from Asbury Park came out, there were a number of people who kind of, they kind of frowned on the new Dylan tag that Columbia tried to pin on Bruce. And there were a number of people who perhaps didn't quite get what that album was all about or what Bruce was all about. And of course, they went to see him live like you did, and things had changed. You were a music critic back then. You lived in that world. When was the first time you ever heard about Bruce? And I'm sure you listened to Greetings. What was your impressions of Greetings?
Of course, I received, as the lead critic and editor of the record section, every record company sent me every album every month. The 20 new Columbia albums would come in a package, and I could check them all out, and combined with information that I was hearing about the group or reading about them or seeing about them, decide which ones to assign to either review myself or assign to somebody. And Lester Bangs was one of the great rock critics. And for a little while, I got him to write for Rolling Stone. And then there was some whatever, then he stopped. But I gave him the album to review. And he wrote a classic Lester, very wild, very extravagant. And I read it as ultimately favorable, but with a lot of detours. And I had listened to the album superficially. No, I take that back. I listened to the album, and I remember I just loved at that time Blinded by the Light, and guitar came on at the beginning. And I said, you know what? Everybody is referencing Dylan. This has a lot to do with the band, that particular song, and who I loved, and but I did not really get involved deeply with the album. The Wildly Innocent, I thought was, from before I saw Bruce, I thought it was a masterpiece. And I thought the writing was just outrageous. And then I went back to greetings and got into
I
greetings.
see. When you saw Bruce for the first time, um, obviously you wrote about this, but for those people who have never read that review, what was it about his performance that night at Harvard Square that just knocked you over?
Now, keeping in mind, this wasn't the one that I wrote, the famous Future of Rock and Roll about.
Right.
This was just a an experience of seeing the show. This is how extreme my reaction was. I said to myself, as a frustrated musician, as somebody who would have perhaps liked to have had that career, but didn't have the confidence and belief in myself to make the commitment that you had to make. So I'm watching him, and it was Boom and Davey were, and I said to myself at some point, I said, if I had the talent, which I don't, but if I did, this is exactly what he's doing here. This is exactly what I would want to do. The way he was mixing the elements, soul, folk on there, the whole unique feel, the whole creation, the whole world of the Wildly Innocent and the East Street Shuffle, uh, was so magnificent, and uh, that's I just identified with it,
Yeah. Yeah.
in a very few, something that happened very, very rarely, but it happened before. But it happened when I heard the freewheeling Bob Dylan. It happened when I heard England's newest hitmakers, Rolling Stones' first album. But this was more than this was just electrifying.
Yeah.
The album, and New York City Serenade. And you see that when I saw the show and I knew the album, and so Bruce, who was so creative then as now, but who goes into a club with, tiny, depressing amount of people, perhaps, although everybody there was a fan. It was small, but they came to see him. He starts the show with New York City Serenade, like a 10-minute version of it. This is counter to every lesson about doing shows, performing, you could have, it's the slowest song that he played. It people are expecting, some real strong rock song to get things started. It's just a natural thing that normally happens. And I was so flabbergasted that he did that, and so moved by it and impressed by it. And he said, "What is this guy up to?" Anyway.
Yeah. Well, your two things come to mind. Number one is your love of the band. I think was an easy segue into the E Street Band back then, because as like what you said, with Boom Carter on drums and David Sanchez on keyboards, Bruce was experimenting with elements of jazz, R&B, folk, rock, basically the American songscape, just like the band did. And there's an easy segue. I always thought the same thing. And then the second thing is that I love too, because I remember seeing Bruce back at the time, and feeling the same way you did. Wow, what an interesting way to start a concert. But it indicated Bruce's great storytelling ability right off the bat. You know, this was going to be an evening of stories and storytelling, and that's what made it so exciting for me. And it seems like it was the same thing for you as well.
Well, you just said a great word there, the storytelling, because Bruce is always in the middle of telling a story. On every song, every album, every show, there is some whole, there is some, you know, larger thing that the songs are components of. When you go to making an album, when Bruce would go to make an album, um, he was trying to put a whole world on. He was trying to put everything on the record,
Yeah.
and um, so that incredible ambition. I mean, he in a completely non-offensive way, in a quiet way, as I got to know him very quickly. But he had an ambition, and his ambition was real simple. It wasn't real simple, but I'm going to sum it up this way.
Yeah.
His ambition was to be great. And I was a guy who wanted to be doing what he was able to do, who knew I would never be great.
Right.
And that's why I had gravitated to other roles, you know, and a baseball umpire, a famous baseball umpire. He's famous for, you know, like a showman, you know, he always,
Yeah.
he wrote a memoir, and for some reason I read it. And he's telling a story about how he played in the minor leagues. He was desperate, he loved the game. And he realized he was never going to be a major leaguer. So he figured out, he became an umpire. And then the last thing he says in the book is, he thanked all the players for letting him be part of the game.
Mm.
And that's me.
Yeah, yeah.
That's how I feel about it. You know?
Well, John, we really appreciate you going back in time. That was really interesting, a lot of fun to do as well. And I'm hoping that at some point in the future we can catch up and continue the story, because certainly we'd love to hear about what happens next once that famous phone call from Bruce comes and the relationship becomes deep-seated and well, permanent. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your time. And again, congratulations on your induction to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And we'll see you next time.
Bob, Eileen, thank you very much. I enjoyed it terrifically. So,
Great. All right, until next time, take care.